In the last section, we started to run into a problem that we've seen once before inside this course. We made a change to the source code of one of our files, but that change was not immediately reflected inside the running container. In this section, we're going to figure out how we can somehow get this change to somewhat cleverly show up inside of that running Docker container without us having to stop it, rebuild the image, and then restart the container. So let's get to it. I want to first begin by giving you a quick reminder of how our Docker file is currently working. We first begin by copying over the package.json file. We then run npm install, and then most importantly, we run that copy command, which takes the public directory, the src directory, and everything else inside of here and copies them over into our working directory of /app. So just remember that for a second. All right. So I want to show you that same flow kind of in a diagram format. So like we just said, we get our package.json copied over, not reflected in this diagram. We install the dependencies, and then at some point in time, we make a copy of src and public, and we move those copies into that container. Remember that that is a temporary container that is created during the image building process. When we make these copies over here, we are essentially taking a snapshot of the contents of src and public. It's a snapshot that is locked in time and by default is not going to be updated anytime we make a change to this code. So in order to get these changes that we're making to files inside of src and public, we need to kind of abandon this approach of doing the straight copy. So rather than doing the straight copy, we're going to adjust the docker run command that we use to start up our running container. By adjusting this command, we're going to be making use of a feature included with Docker called volumes. So we're going to make use of a Docker volume. With the Docker volume, we essentially set up a placeholder of sorts inside of our Docker container. And so we're no longer going to copy over the entire src directory or the entire public directory. Instead, you can kind of imagine that we're going to put a sort of, that's not how you spell it, we're going to put in a kind of reference here instead. The volume is essentially going to set up a reference that's going to point back to our local machine and give us access to the files and folders inside of these folders on the local machine. So a Docker volume can kind of be thought of in a very similar fashion to the port mappings that we were setting up before. The port mapping that we were using mapped a port inside the container to a port outside the container. With a Docker volume, we're essentially setting up a mapping from a folder inside the container to a folder outside the container. Now you might be wondering, why did we not just make use of volumes before, if this kind of solves the issue of hooking up files and folders inside the container to files and folders outside of it? Well, the issue is that setting up a Docker volume is sometimes a little bit of a pain in the rear, just because of the syntax we have to use when we run Docker run. So let's take a look at the syntax we're going to use to set up these volumes when we execute the docker run command at our terminal. All right, so this is it. As you can see, we're going to add on a fair bit here. Now we first start off with docker run -p 3000, but we're going to add on these two additional switches. Now I want to ignore this first switch right here for just a moment and just focus on the second one. So on this second little switch, we say -v, which is used to set up a volume, and then we say $present working directory. This $sign with pwd, or present working directory, inside of that set of parentheses is a little bit of a shortcut. If you flip back over to your terminal right now and stop the running process, if you are on Windows, I want you to know right now, if you're on Windows and you're running Command Prompt or PowerShell, this command is not going to work, but it will work if you're running git bash. So back at your terminal, you can run pwd, and you'll see that it's going to print out the path to your present working directory on your machine. So by putting in pwd right here, we're essentially saying get the present working directory, or the path to it, and take this folder, like this front end folder and everything inside of it, and map it up to the app folder running inside of our container. This pwd thing right here is something that you're going to use every time if you want to use Docker run to start up the container. And so writing out this kind of long-winded switch right here, yeah, like I said, is just a little bit annoying. So in general, well, that's exactly why we have not used volumes up to this point. Now, again, there's this other switch on here. you'll notice that the first switch right here does not have a colon like the second one does. I want to first run the docker run command without the first switch, so we're going to run it only with the second one and our image ID on the end, and we're just going to see what happens, because you're going to notice some pretty interesting behavior. All right, so let's try running this. Now I'm going to first rebuild my image with docker build-f dockerfile.dev. I'm going to copy my ID, and then I'll execute docker run -p 3000:3000. We'll do -v with a $, a parenthesis, pwd. We'll then put the colon in, a /app, and then finally I'll paste the image ID. Now again, if you are on PowerShell or if you're on Windows Command Prompt, this command is not going to work because we are making use of pwd right there. Now, if you did not install Git Bash earlier inside this course, and if you're not using Git Bash right now, you can either use Git Bash, or in just a moment, I'm going to show you a workaround where we do not have to use this kind of long form syntax right here. So you can just hold on for a second if you're using Command Prompt or PowerShell. All right, so I'm going to start that up, and you're going to very quickly see an error message. If you read this error message somewhat closely, you'll notice that it appears that the project did attempt to start up, specifically the React project, but we got this message here that said React scripts not found. So this is clearly, well, maybe not clearly, I take that back, not clearly, but let me just kind of cut to the chase here and tell you we're seeing this error message because we obviously kind of skipped off this additional little argument right here. But I wanted to show you why this argument was necessary. Let's take a quick pause. When we come back to the next section, I'll tell you about exactly what's happening right now and why we are seeing that error message pop up in our terminal.